Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this panel. I'm just going to start by apologizing to those who are behind me. Unfortunately, I have to turn mine back to you. My name is Reem Mumtaz. I am the France correspondent for Politico, and it is my great honor to moderate this panel, which promises to be quite interesting. So the headline is People Power versus Populism. Allow me first to just introduce our panelists. To my left is William Davies, the co-director of the Political Economy Research Centre in the UK. Next to him is Carne Ross, executive director and independent diplomat. To my right is Jen Schrady. She's a sociologist, she teaches at Sciences Po, and then Jamie Bartlett, who is the director of the Center for the Analysis of Social Media. We are going to start right into questions. I want to introduce our app called Bcast. You can join the event on the app and submit your questions. We are looking forward to a very lively conversation and hoping to include as many of your questions as possible. So please go ahead, go crazy. I'm sure it's not lost on anyone in this room what we are facing and have been facing for a few years now in our societies, democratic societies, the tension between the rise of populist leaders and at the same time, we're seeing these movements that are powered by people who want to take back control. We hear that word a lot, take back control. It's used by parties like the Front National, which is now redubbed the Rassemblement National in France, far right, but also Occupy Wall Street. And we'd love to explore the similarities, but also the differences between these two phenomena, populism and people power, people-driven movements. So I'm going to just open the discussion on that and allow my panelists to just jump in and tell me, do they think there are similarities between the two, or are there real differences and we should keep that nuance? Carne, do you want to start?
Sure, it's Khan, but yeah, I mean, there are real similarities in that they both come from a similar place of frustration, a frustration over lack of agency in the current dispensation, that the so-called democracies that we live in do not give them a voice, and that those democracies represent an economic order which is fundamentally unfair and also denies them agency, economic agency. So they're denied political and economic agency, and that is the basic motive that drives both the far-right populists, but also what you could describe in very general terms, and I'm very wary of generalizing about these movements, as, I wouldn't call them people power, but protest movements against the economic order, such as Extinction Rebellion or Occupy Wall Street.
Why wouldn't you call them people power? What's the problem with calling them that?
Because they don't have power. That's the basic problem. And that is the jump that these movements have to make, is from protesting to a government and asking government to change to actually becoming government. And I don't mean becoming political parties, because Podemos in Spain illustrates the problems with that, of a small group of people trying to co-opt a larger mass movement. It's actually to build new forms of democracy, mass democracy, participatory democracy, which in my view is inherently superior to representative democracy.
Anyone wants to jump in?
I think that on the one hand, yes, there is certainly a lack of agency that folks have been feeling, but I think where that really derives, if you think about the history of some of these protest movements or populist movements, whatever you want to call them, really started about 10 years ago, right? With not only Occupy Wall Street, but the Indignados in Spain, and movements spread all over the world in 2011 in particular. But what happened right before then, right? So we had a worldwide economic collapse, a very big recession. And what's interesting is that what was happening in the US in particular right after that was the birth of the Tea Party movement, right? That really was responding to a number of things. It was responding to the first Black president, certainly, but there was also a really key economic component where people really felt like they were losing their economic power that they had for so long. And then what happened is, these movements on the left, Occupy, Ignados, et cetera, that really captured the imagination of people worldwide, right? And were engaging with social media. And the world kind of forgot about the Tea Party movement and conservatives, right? And it's really been recently that more conservative movements have also been on the rise, that people have finally paid attention with the election of a number of candidates, the president in my country, to name one in particular, Donald Trump. So I think that while people have felt a lack of power, I think the economic piece is also very key.
William?
Yeah, I just wanted to throw in another aspect to this distinction that you raised between people power and populism. I mean, the way I would come at this is to start with the understanding that liberal democracies for a long time have depended on multiple systems of representation, not just what we call representative democracy via parliaments and elected politicians, but also the role of journalists in representing the news to us every day, the role of the judiciary in the representation of the justice system. Experts represent nature to us and society to us via expert knowledge and facts and statistics and so on. And I think that where populism becomes something quite distinctive and quite dangerous is when figures such as Nigel Farage in my own country, Donald Trump, and others say that all of those representatives, not just those in Parliament, but also those in the media, those in the courts, and potentially those in universities whose job it is to, as best they can, represent facts and knowledge to us, are corrupt and actually working in their own interests rather than in the public interests, which is why this phrase, the enemies of the people, isn't just used to target the so-called mainstream politicians, the liberal elites in Parliament and so on, but also it's used against the media, particularly the professional media, not the sort of quasi-amateur media of InfoWars or social media or this sort of thing, but equally it can be targeted against judges. Our newspaper in the UK, the Daily Mail, used the phrase the enemies of the people against the judges that upheld the ruling to ensure that Brexit went before Parliament, which has now caused Theresa May all of these headaches. But also potentially, I'm an academic, universities become seen as being part of some sort of culture war, that they're full of cultural Marxists who are imposing their own value system on people and this sort of thing. So to put this in the most broad terms, my understanding of populism is that it discounts the very possibility of representation, and not just in democratic sense, but also that it's not possible for these professional, highly educated graduates living in the large cities to tell the truth to everybody else because they have their own political agenda. And that, I think, is not true of many forms of what you might call people power. I think there are left populists who flirt with it. In Britain, Jeremy Corbyn certainly flirts with that on the left. But I don't think that you need to have a mass participatory democratic movement that makes that particular turn towards the blaming of these various forms of mediation.
Jamie?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I mean, populism has obviously become a very easy way to discount or ignore anyone that you disagree with. I mean, these guys are populists, they're idiots, they're stupid, they're wrong. And I think that's also a mistake. And the reason I think that's a mistake is because I think politics as a whole is becoming more populist. I see populism as a style rather than a particular set of messages. And it's a style which, in my opinion, is almost perfectly suited to modern technology, partly based on what Will said, in fact. I mean, a rejection of various forms of representation. If you think that populism is a style, I think the obvious description of that style is simplistic, easy, sticky, emotive messages and a explicit dichotomy between good, ordinary, decent, hard-working, honest people and some kind of shadowy elite. Those two things to me comprise populism. Everyone is becoming populist now. And the reason everyone's becoming populist is because, in my opinion, social media platforms essentially are advertising companies in disguise as technology firms, And advertising companies are all about sticky, simple, emotional content.
What are they advertising, the social media companies?
The entire business model is premised on trying to get people to click on stuff. And that's where 95% of the revenue for Google and Facebook and Twitter and so on all comes from. And advertising entirely, of course, is about emotional, simplistic, easy stuff. And social media as well, of course, gives that. This is why every populist, as we call populist movement, every populist movement, I use inverted commas, absolutely were the early adopters and expert at using these platforms because it suits them very well, because they say this is our route to the ordinary people, unfiltered by the biased media that cuts us out. So who, in my opinion, is the perfect social media politician? It's not Nigel Farage, it's someone more like Beppe Grillo, who is both a kind of a sort of people power, groundswell of ordinary people trying to get involved in politics in a brand new way, but also has all the trappings of a populist leader insofar as it's all about this dichotomy between good people and bad elites and, you know, comedic, obstinate, funny, insulting messaging, which does incredibly well online.
And yeah.
I couldn't agree more, and I think in my historic arc that I tried to give earlier about kind of the left and right populist movements, what I've found in my research is that conservatives, the more conservative right-wing populist groups, have been much more effective in a lot of the use of social media and really dominate online activism now because of the very straightforward, simplistic messages around freedom, right? Broadly defined, depending on the context. And that when the Tea Party movement emerged, for example, in the United States, there was a growing conservative media ecosystem. And when I say media, I mean more than just social media, right? You had conservative think tanks, you had the rise of conservative Christian media, and so you had this very organic social movement that had emerged, as well as you had this ecosystem in place and this very simplistic messaging, where on the left, you know, there's this idea of fairness rather than freedom. And so there's this general idea among the left, and again, I'm being very, parsimonious or simplistic in talking about the left and the right, in that groups on the left often want to involve a diverse group of people around gender, around race, around class, disability, social, sexual orientation, right? And those kind of messages and that kind of inclusiveness is much more challenging and doesn't always work as well with social media in particular. And I think that's one of the reasons why those sticky messages with social media now have been working much more effectively on the right.
There's an additional reason, I mean, I'm sure you're absolutely correct, but there's an additional reason which is interesting, which is that, well, it's to build on what you were saying, really, that you could look at it as, to take a mid-20th century formulation, the right wing is hedgehogs, and the left wing is foxes. Foxes know many things, and the hedgehog knows one thing, in Isaiah Berlin's terminology. But there's also another really interesting distinction, which is the nature of the prescription that the left and the right are offering. The left's prescription is government, basically. They turn to government to deliver social justice. And if you speak for the people, it's very difficult to pretend that government is your answer. Whereas the conservatives, the right wing, particularly in America, are very anti-government, of course. And therefore, there's a real synergy between their claim about what the answer is and the manner of their speaking, if you see what I mean.
So in listening to you, there is something that keeps coming back at the heart of both, which is people. Both sides, you know, people power movements, but also populists claim to be speaking for the people. How do we define the people? But also, how did democracy, which is clearly based on the demos, so people, lose its ability to represent properly the people? What went wrong? Is it a crisis of representation? And I'm not just talking about political representation in the way we think of it, i.e. elections, whether it's parliamentary or directly presidential, but also is it a problem of representation in the media or in society, in our daily lives. Yeah, go ahead, Karin. Well, yeah.
I was just going to say. I mean, there's, there was before these ruptures of the particularly last 5 years, there was quite a growing body of literature in political science about depoliticization, alienation. These books called things like Post-Democracy, Ruling the Void. These sorts of books about the fact that Europe and the United States, in some ways, had long had this problem where turnouts in presidential elections have always been far lower than on average in the UK, in the US than in Europe. But there'd been a kind of sense since the 1990s that representative democracy was losing its luster for various reasons. One being that politics had become very professionalized, that parties had become these kind of machines where the most powerful people in these parties were now spin doctors, former journalists, that meanwhile, that television, there was this whole sort of pessimism throughout the 80s and 90s, Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, these sorts of books, that people were now more interested in watching TV than they were in politics. There was I think a famous sort of juxtaposition that someone made in the early 2000s between the way in which reality television now feels more like participation, meanwhile politics looks more like entertainment, and these two things had kind of flipped around. This as well was tied up with what many people would call neoliberalism, a sense that the scope of political options had become very limited to a particular range of sort of minor welfare reforms around labour market flexibility and a sort of tax movements within sort of the order of about sort of 2 or 3%. So it's not that, I mean, people kind of felt that representative democracy was in great trouble for quite a long time, and that participation was in this sort of secular decline. What I don't think many of these analysts really sort of predicted, partly because they didn't see things like social media coming around the corner, was that there was a kind of limit to how far this sort of alienation and depoliticization could go before there was a kind of, like stretching an elastic band, that things would then come back again. So representative democracy, no one has really, this sort of pessimism about representative democracy is extremely old, decades old. I mean, maybe it's even as old as representative democracy itself. I think it's the re-energization of democracy that is the shock, not the kind of crisis of representative democracy as such.
I think one of the things we tend to underestimate is the appeal of totalitarianism, of autocracy and fascism. Karl Popper analysed this very effectively during the Second World War. It's something about the power of the crowd, that it's nice to be part of a movement that is aiming for a singular ideal, a view of a utopian better society, whether that is a racially pure society or a society where everybody is equal, both of which require coercion and domination and autocracy, and both of which secured enormous support in the mid-20th century from a highly cultured, educated people in Germany, from a highly cultured and educated people in Russia, and we have to tackle that. I think we have to find some other ideal that is a little more appealing than the managerial model of politics discussing 1 pence or 2 pence on income tax, or how we do education policy. Something that animates us, animates the soul, makes the spirit soar, makes you want to charge the enemy, but for democracy, for tolerance, for heterogeneity.
Who's the enemy in that case? How do you?
Well, the enemy is always autocracy, the people of singular minds, the people who think they have the right to dominate others for their ideal. They are always my enemy. I believe in heterogeneity and diversity, tolerance, but I've got to make that into a flag worth fighting for.
How do you do that?
That is a good question. I think you have to access this part of you that isn't rational. I think it's not about rational policy making over education or health or this or that. It's about accessing and giving permission to something that rationalists and empiricists have long sought to deny, which is this animal, emotional, irrational part of us that is actually the motor of almost everything we do.
Is the fear with tapping into that animal instinct that it will be against minorities in societies, and we now live in societies that are much more diverse than they used to be in the 19th or 20th century.
I think there's a completely opposite way of looking at it, which is that it's actually about love. It's actually love. It's about human love. It's about accepting that the greatest motive of humankind is our love for other people of whatever kind. And that is much, much deeper and more profound and more exciting than this awful, boring liberal democracy debate about this or that policy or this policy.
Love. I mean, do you see in the way a lot of these populists have been talking about migrants, about Muslims, about homosexuals in the world, do you hear love when they talk about them, about excluding them?
It's understanding me. I'm talking about the opposite of that.
No, but I mean, how do you tap into that love to counter these people?
They're tapping into hate. And love is the obvious opposite of hate, but it actually is animated in the same irrational part of us. And we've seen the triumph of rationalism ever since the Enlightenment, this belief that we need to deny this passionate part, this irrational part of us. And we need to find a blend of the two, the rational and the irrational, to overcome these very powerful irrational forces, which we will not stop by nice debate and nice policy making. Trump is odious and disgusting, and most Americans see that, and yet they still vote for him. Why? Why?
I mean, I should be the one talking about love. I'm not even wearing a tie. Khan's got a tie on and a suit, and I'm taking the opposite.
Well, that's a stereotype, though.
I'm joking. I'm joking. But actually, I've spent an awful lot of time within populist movements, right-wing populist movements, which are apparently motivated by hate, but actually when you're inside them, they're motivated by love as well of each other. It's a very powerful force. They have a huge sense of community, a shared struggle. They would say, we're not motivated by hate. They then look out at the anti-fascists demonstrating them and say, look at these hateful people calling us X, Y, and Z all the time. These well-educated university degree-holding students. I'm a working class man out here trying to fight for something I care about, and I'm just getting bombarded with hate. I've had bottles thrown at me when I've been, I was very careful to show I was a reporter, but when I've been marching up and down the streets with English Defence League people, and it feels from the inside that you are surrounded by hate and that you are loved by everybody that you're with. So it's never quite as simple as those guys are full of hate and these guys are full of love. But I do think, just to talk about representation and the crisis of it, I think there is something new here, which is a huge disconnect between how we now live our lives as consumers and how we live our lives as citizens. And I always think to people in this room, some of you will be old enough to remember what it was like what you had to do to get your photographs developed, and the unbelievable cost and time, mostly for nothing, that you had to go through to try to go to a pharmacy and pay money to get your holiday photos developed, which sounds ludicrous to a 21-year-old now, but it seemed normal at the time. But our lives as consumers are increasingly, we don't need representation. We can do everything ourselves directly. Everything is personalized to us. We have great choice. It's free. It's immediate. And then we look at democracy, this thing that's barely changed at all, slugging, slow, you never quite get what you want. And it seems quite a ludicrous difference. And this is why all populist movements, whether it's the Gilets jaunes or the Five-Star Movement, this is why I'm saying everyone's getting more populist, or Nigel Farage or whoever, they always talk about changing politics for good, going back to the people, you having your say. All of them are in favour of more polls, more direct democracy, because it suits the narrative of representation is no longer necessary, because representation is always corrupted by a small group of people, wills people at the top who run everything. And I think that disconnection is becoming just a sort of natural default psychological position for society, because it's a reflection of how technology's changed how we live our lives. And in that sense, I don't think it's going to go away.
Why do these movements always, or why do maybe people always have to define themselves and organize themselves in opposition of others? The Gilets jaunes, for example, I'm a journalist. I covered the movement for a long time. I was at a lot of the demonstrations, and I would talk to a lot of them, and I can tell you that there are definitely people within that movement that have very legitimate demands, that feel like they are completely excluded from the current society that we live in, whose economic needs are shunted to the side. And then there are those in that movement who, at the end of the day, now they are the only people who are or most of the people who are in the street, who continue to demonstrate, who, you know, will accost me and talk to me about how all these migrants that have come into France are spreading sickle cell disease, about how they would be extremely aggressive towards us, the media, get physical against us. Why do we see that exclusion of the other so strong in these movements? And we don't necessarily see it, perhaps maybe not as clearly on the other side.
Well, I think you do see it on the other side as well. I just think it's different groups of people that are excluded.
How do you see it on the other side?
Well, I think on the other side, I mean, again, I don't want to sound like I'm a great defender of radical right-wing populism, but I know from their perspective, they see themselves as being constantly excluded, belittled, demeaned, ignored. And whether that's true or not, I mean, it's not just a sense that we exclude other people. I think everyone. So part of the challenge of representative democracy is that nobody ever really gets what they want anymore. And so everybody feels that they're the oppressed ones. I mean, you may have noticed there's not a group in society that does not now feel oppressed, that they aren't getting their way, that they aren't getting what they want. Middle-class white men, who are always discussed as being the oppressors, I think feel quite oppressed. Everyone's beating up on us. You know, I haven't done anything wrong. And so the nature of representative democracy means no one gets their way. Everybody feels somehow excluded. And therefore, certain groups are always going to come out and say, you know, these people are getting more of a say than me. We're being silenced. That's why we've been forced to hit the streets. And this is why that distinction between populism and people power, I don't think is as great as maybe some people might.
Have our societies gotten too egocentric? Have we forgotten what it's like to think about the greater common good? Was that a fallacy that we believed in, and now we're back to being all individualistic?
Pass that one to someone else.
Are we an individualistic society, right?
We're more than we used to be.
Right, right.
You know?
Well, I think, actually, I'll turn that around a little bit, because I think perhaps some of the people you may be talking to on the street with the Gilets jaunes movement before had relatively comfortable jobs, maybe weren't elite, but could pay their bills, could pay for their gas, etc.
Middle class.
Middle class, right? And because people now, especially in rural areas in France, for example, have to drive farther and farther to have a job if they can even find one, no longer does the collective state provide for people in the same way, at least. It still does much more than the US, for sure, but provide for people in the same way, right? And so there's a great sociologist, McVeigh, who made this argument around the Ku Klux Klan or the Tea Party, or perhaps, you know, part of the Gilets jaunes, not all of it. The Gilets jaunes is very complex. This power devaluation theory, right? So no longer are these white middle-class folks have their relatively comfortable lifestyle and have power, that you do have more people participating politically. And so people not only feel the economic strain, but also politically, right? Again, so when Barack Obama is elected president, that power had shifted, right? So you do have this power devaluation. But in terms of, I think, the piece that we've been kind of hovering around, this individualism, right? That I think you mentioned the Bowling Alone book, right? Which really started to speak to this idea of the decline of civic organizations, right? So that's been this theory that we have this decline of civic organizations. And at the same time, when Robert Putnam wrote that book, Bowling Alone, we had the rise of the internet, right? Which is perceived as this very individual platform that we can all post whatever we want, right? Or as Jamie said, we all have the ability to participate or to share and take photos. However, I think there's a couple of challenges or problems with that. One is that not everyone is able to participate in the same way, especially with digital technology, right? So when we see the Gilets Jaunes hashtag, or the Occupy Wall Street hashtag, or the 5-Star Movement hashtag on Twitter or other social media, who is actually able to post? It isn't a collection of thousands and thousands of individuals. That's part of it, sure. But when you actually break down who is posting on social media about these movements, it is more bots. It is very structured, resourced organizations. And again, groups on the right have really been able to capitalize on these very populist sentiments because they have really been kind of at the forefront of what's been happening. And if we look at, I'll give one other quick history lesson and do another shout out to another sociologist, since I'm a sociologist myself, is Dylan Riley, who did a very interesting historical comparative look at European countries almost 100 years ago, and which became fascist and which didn't. And what he found was very interesting. It wasn't the states, the governments, without a lot of civic organizations. It was the countries that had a very strong civic and civil society that authoritarian governments were able to capture and tackle and really harness that power. And in the same way, I found in my research, again, that these very organic, not just populist movements, but organizations, right-wing organizations in the US, were really able to expand even more because of the power of this conservative ecosystem.
I just wanted, I wanted to sort of touch on the same point and also slightly relate back to what Jamie was talking about, which is, again, this sort of what we call a kind of crisis of representation, not just in the democratic sphere, but in the media sphere. And I think your example of the cameras and the old style analog thing is a very, very good example. I think what we've got to think about here is the collision between a set of what we now would call legacy institutions, including the mainstream media of the broadcasters and the press and so on, and this sudden explosion of a promise of direct voice, immediacy, and the capturing of everything as data, which is the sort of ideology of Silicon Valley. It's what the media scholar Mark Andreevich calls the promise of framelessness, the idea that it might be possible that every voice can be heard, everything can be captured, everything can be photographed. It's both a surveillance ideology and a kind of democratic ideology all at once, which is that nothing needs to somehow sort of, if you go back 20 years, all public knowledge was generally channeled via broadcasters, newspapers, universities, these kind of legacy analog institutions. But nowadays, those legacy institutions have survived, but they've survived against this backdrop of this sort of ideology of framelessness. And if you want to take an example of where and how this might make people very angry, take Twitter, and I'm sure there are lots of people on Twitter in this room. Anybody now can open a Twitter account, as long as they've got a smartphone. Or any kind of other internet access. They can tweet, they can say what they like, they might have 5 followers, they might have 500 million followers, they might have any kind of number of followers. And then within that kind of Twitter sphere where anyone can speak, anyone can have a platform, anyone can have a voice, there are these people who not only seem to have far more followers than anybody else, they're also being paid to do it. And those people are called journalists. And it seems incredibly unfair if you're within that kind of space where the public sphere suddenly holds out this promise of framelessness, that every voice can be included, that everybody can have their say, that you can have a kind of complete participatory sphere without having to be channeled via a bottleneck of any kind, that nevertheless those bottlenecks from the 1990s still seem to have their power. And I think a lot of the kind of resentment we see around us, that's just one example of Twitter, but a lot of the resentment towards towards universities, towards professional politicians, towards established parties, towards professional media institutions, is this kind of sense that there is now an alternative to those things. Now, I don't think that alternative is actually one we want to go down. I think there is a kind of a dangerous commonality between the ideology of Silicon Valley and the ideology of Donald Trump in its sort of nurturing of conspiracy theories in various ways. But from some perspectives, the continued power of those legacy analog institutions in our digital age is unjust and insulting in various ways.
But let me jump.
Add something very quickly, because I agree entirely with that. I mean, but basically, Will just explained what I was trying to say far better than I did. But it's not only going to be the legacy institutions, but because I think people are beginning to realise that the technology platforms themselves aren't necessarily just this neutral, wonderful platform that everyone can join and have an equal say on, which is why the Gilets jaunes and most recently Donald Trump have started to turn against Facebook, saying, well, hang on a minute, you are silencing us now. You've decided to quieten us down. You've turned down the volume. You've delisted us. You've taken us off your news feeds. And so even within the new platform institutions, people are getting increasingly frustrated that there's some form of unaccountable power there too that doesn't even live up to its own promises.
Okay, 1 second. Is there a fallacy in talking about, in the internet age, the equality of speech? What about the value of expertise?
Yeah,
Why?
We're getting awfully intellectual about this and theorizing and talking about technology in a sort of McLuhan-like way, that technology has created its own phenomena. But fascism existed long before technology.
Allow me to finish my question.
Apologies.
1 second. The question is, you were discussing, you gave a very specific example on Twitter, which is journalists who are paid to do this job have more followers or seem to, their speech is elevated. How would you feel if people started saying, well, maybe you as an academic, your knowledge, all of the work you put in to becoming an academic actually should be on the same level of someone who's worked in a factory all their life, without being patronizing toward the person who's worked in a factory all their life, but maybe their level of expertise in certain, in your topics of expertise are not on the same level. Is that also a problem of populism, that we are putting on the same level people who shouldn't be really on the same level?
Well, this is a political question, and I mean, knowledge has always been political. I mean, I'm a sociologist, and I work in a tradition that takes anthropological knowledge very seriously, and one of the strengths of anthropology, in contrast to something like economics, is that it does respect the first-hand experience of people who are actually doing things and engaged in the world and have their own stories to tell and their own history and their own embodied knowledge and this sort of thing. And there have been economists who have recognized this as well. People like Friedrich Hayek has recognized the same thing. So, this is not a new question, but I think that the one of the problems, and this is a question of sort of science communication as much as anything else, is the person who says, God, this winter's been very cold. Climate change is a complete load of liberal elitist nonsense. And that challenge is a very particular one, whereby scientists then have to open up their methods and their processes so as to communicate why they know what they know and why they are confident about what they are confident about. Equally, I think journalists need to do a better job of saying, well, when I covered this protest, when I covered this political event, I used this particular type of training where I am encouraged to try and speak to a different range of voices, and I didn't speak to that voice for this particular reason. It wasn't because I'm trying to censor them, but I had particular reasons why I spoke to that voice and not that voice. Now, these are kind of methods that we've taken for granted for hundreds of years in the history of modern factual evidence gathering and reporting. And in some sense, we're having to sort of not relearn them, but rediscover why we value them and to do a better job of explaining them. Now, one of the great disadvantages of methodology in both an academic sense but also in a journalistic sense of fact-finding and checking is that it is slow. And it's slower than the capturing of something on a smartphone via the medium of a camera or a piece of video or something like that.
A conspiracy spreads much quicker than fact-checked.
And cameras, I think we live in an age where photography there is a danger that photography is becoming a kind of gold standard of truth in our current society, and it has never been that. Throughout the history of photography, it's always been used as a tool of deception, and you think of the Zapruder video of JFK. I mean, it has always generated as many conspiracy theories and as controversies as it has alleviated. This is not an alternative to what have been conceived of as fact since the early 17th century. And that's the danger of this culture and technology of immediacy that I think that people like Trump benefit from and that Silicon Valley profits hugely from.
Arne?
Well, forgive me for interrupting you. It comes from a place of frustration, though, that with all due respect to the academics here, and you know, I have a great academic tendency myself, is that I think academia disappeared down a hole in the post-20th century, it became much better at explaining neoliberalism and explaining its cultural artifacts through deconstruction. You know, here in the home of Derrida and Foucault, perhaps it's appropriate to make this point. It disappeared down a hole, a rabbit hole, of its own fantasies rather than fighting neoliberalism. And it became co-opted by neoliberalism. Academics fought for grants which were a function of government funding, but also of wealthy philanthropists. I mean, I'm no one to speak. I work for an NGO that relies on philanthropy from a lot of wealthy people. We've all become co-opted instead of actually fighting the phenomenon that we claim to criticize. And I think we have to go back to basic facts. You know, rather than seeking to explain it, we have to fight it. You know, the delegitimization of government, I don't think particularly is a function of social media, though I'm sure it assists it. Government delegitimized itself through the 2007 financial crisis by letting the bankers off from the great crimes that they committed, but also the Iraq War. I was part of this. I was a British diplomat at the time. I was responsible for weapons of mass destruction at the UN Security Council, or rather getting rid of them at the UN Security Council. And I saw how my government lied about this. And the man who helped perpetrate that lie is now presenting programs on the BBC. He's now part of the media. You can see why people are skeptical. You can see why people are furious. I'm furious. I think government delegitimized itself in my eyes. I felt, how can these people who I have dinner with, they're my friends, do something that is so utterly divorced from what people want, from what is the right thing to do, that cost 500,000 lives. This is a great crime that was committed, and it's far more important to focus on these crimes that have been committed, these wrongs that government has done, rather than trying to explain it and re-justify and revalidate our own way of looking at it.
So is it possible for government to redeem itself, in your opinion?
No, I don't, actually. I really, really, really passionately don't. I think that it's possible that a leader may emerge who's somehow able to capture all of this rage and channel it into something more constructive. But I certainly don't see it in Britain, and I certainly don't. I mean, the young Democrats, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in America, they're slightly capturing it, but I actually think it has to come from a restructuring of democracy itself, to make it mass and participatory genuinely, to make it more communal, to make it more local. We can see examples of this. This is why I'm an anarchist. I'm proud to call myself an anarchist. I believe in people power, of people taking decisions at the bottom level, and this has worked. It worked in ancient Greece, where citizens took it in turns, as long as they were men, of course, to govern. But also now in Syria, in Rojava, in northeast Syria, there is an experiment in communal self-government based on anarchist ideology that is actually working. Nobody talks about it because the mainstream media don't even send people to report on it, and they caricature it as pseudo-communism or neo-Marxism rather than examining it for what it is.
If I may, I actually, in my former life that ended a few months ago, am one of the journalists who used to go to Rojava quite often in the northeast of Syria. It's a bit more complicated than that. It isn't the utopia that some people want it to be, and it's not the awful system that other people want to represent. It's somewhere in between, which is, I guess, what normal kind of human life is like, right? It's always a nuance.
I mean, anarchists never pretend that they're perfect, and they don't pretend that they're creating utopia. And this is, I think, one of the really important distinctions. Socialists and capitalists both claim that things will be better in the future. that present sacrifice is justified by the ideal in the future. Whereas anarchists say, actually, we are imperfect. The process is probably imperfect. We need to constantly work to perfect it. But the process is the point. And the process is that everybody has an equal say. It may not produce perfect outcomes, and I've no doubt that the transformation to a system like that would be very painful and messy in our society, which is so deeply entrenched in its own habits. But the basic principle of people having equality of power is the problem at the heart of these protest movements, and it is the answer to the crisis of democracy.
Karin, you said something about local government, and there was a question that was submitted through BCAS that I can't find it right now, but I do remember reading it, and it said something like, you know, local government is better because it's closer to the people it's supposed to serve, but often those local representatives it's harder to reach them, especially on a national level, than it is, for example, and the person who submitted the question mentioned the ease of reaching MEPs, EU MEPs, on the level of the European Parliament, compared to getting in touch with their local representative. Do you think that's a fair representation of reality, and do you agree with that?
I don't want to hog the mic, but the idea that an MEP is accessible is ludicrous. I mean, do me a favor. Do me a favor. I go to the EEAS. I deal with Brussels a lot. It is not a representative institution. I'm no Brexiter. I believe in the abolition of borders. But Brussels is not representative. I'm sorry. We need to acquaint ourselves with older ideas that have been articulated in the 19th century in particular, of how local democracy can be scaled up. The criticism of localism, of local democracy, is that you can't operate at scale. How can it govern complicated societies? Well, Britain is doing a pretty good demonstration of how the current system is not governing complicated societies already. So let's start with the failure of the current system. But there are models of confederalism where decisions are taken at the bottom and then filtered up to a higher level where they are administered. But the decisions are always taken at the lower level, the very opposite of our current system, where decisions are taken at the top level and administered at the bottom. There are perfectly plausible ways to organize this. So this argument that it cannot operate, that it's impractical, that it can't be done at scale, is simply wrong.
Anyone else jump in? Another question from the audience is direct democracy the answer? Well, Karin says yes. That's pretty simple.
You know, what is direct democracy? I mean, I think that's the same question about what is populism, what is people power, what are we actually talking about? Are we talking about going to the polls on election day in terms of electoral politics, in terms of participatory democracy, you know, the other extreme of everyone making every decision? And certainly people on either side wouldn't argue that it's one or the other. But I think a really key point that I want to make that's been kind of missing in some of these discussions around, you know, whether it's who, you know, people being able to take pictures wherever they want online, or who are these people that think that they can have the same voice as a seasoned journalist, is this idea that everyone can participate in society now with digital technology or in general without understanding the multiple levels of inequality, right? So there are, yes, I will be very academic here, there are countless studies and research that show, just to talk about the digital inequality piece that is my area of expertise, that the level at which digital inequality persists, even in developed countries, right? So it's not just developing third world countries.
It's a big issue in France, and it came out in the Grand Débat.
So this semester I taught a class here at Sciences Po, and I had my students go out to the banlieues, to the public libraries without their smartphones, which was part of one of the biggest challenges for them, and try to use the computers at the local libraries that a lot of people rely on. And it was a big challenge for them, and it was a way to really talk about the ways in which everyone can't just snap pictures or share something on Twitter because they don't have consistent, not only access to the gadgets, consistent high-speed internet access, the skills keeping up with the latest software. I mean, I study social media, and I find it really challenging with all of those things. And I think that to have either this myth of either direct democracy or digital democracy is a myth. And it's interesting when, in talking about all this, one of the titles of my book that I was toying with was the work of democracy, right? It takes a lot of work. And in order, whether we're talking about the internet, whether we're talking about participatory democracy on a regular and basic level, that work really shifts depending on who we're talking about, right? So I can be online 24/7. I can go to meetings, events, etc. Even to sign up for the grand débat, the big debate that emerged after the Gilets jaunes movement. Oftentimes you had to sign up online, right? So who is participating in this participatory democracy and who isn't? Whose voices are we hearing?
Jamie.
I think the support for growth of direct democracy through referendums, online or offline, is pretty much unstoppable. It's much more in keeping with the spirit of the age. For the first time, really, since ancient Athens, it is going to be possible to have everybody contribute directly to almost every decision in government. We do have the technology that allows that to happen, and I think there'll be a thirst for that. I, however, think that's a disaster. I think it can work in particular places where they've got a long tradition and culture of it, but the difficulty is when you try to implant it on an existing system of representative democracy, and then the two things just keep clashing, which is exactly what's going on in the UK. The idea that more direct democracy will make debate more informed, more thoughtful, bring people together, in a country where representative democracy, I can see you putting your hands up. Oh, okay, oh, that's good. So okay. I think at the moment, with the way society works, that's not what's going to happen. It's just going to make things even more divisive. I want to give one last shot, really, at improving the way representative democracy works, to bring in some of Khan's ideas as well, because the flow of information between electors and elected it's ridiculous. It's awful. We go to the ballot box once every 4 or 5 years, and to express our multitude of opinions, we tick one box, or maybe a couple of boxes if you have an alternative vote system or whatever. It's ridiculous. Well, why can't we improve the way representative democracy works first? And there's a million things we can do for that. The great problem with the philosophy of Silicon Valley, which this is related, has been the belief in wise mobs. Howard Reinger wrote a book about this, wise mobs. Mobs are inherently smart, but there's also a long tradition of work in sociology that says that mobs can also be extremely dangerous. Gustave Le Bon, the irrational mob, the mad crowd. And they tend to be supposedly leaderless, but always without rules, end up with leaders that are just completely unaccountable. And this is the problem, I think, with trusting too much in the crowd with the systems that we've got, that is where it will take us.
I agree with almost everything Jamie said, except that my direct democracy is absolutely not referendums. I hate referendums because they're so stupid and simplistic. God help us, any Briton would agree with you. What I'm talking, and also I'm not talking about digital democracy. It's so boring, this endless sort of technology has given us the possibility of digitally taking part. That's not what I'm talking about at all. It has to be in person. You can only relate to somebody in person. If we were having this argument on Twitter, we'd already be raging at each other instead of agreeing with each other, largely. But to go to an academic, James Fishkin in Stanford University did a lot of interesting research that showed that people have a tendency to agree when they meet in person.
So citizen assemblies, deliberative?
Yes, in person, and actually a constant process, not one-off votes about single issues, a constant process so that my concession today may be rewarded by yours tomorrow, and also because of the humanity of meeting in person, that we suddenly see that awful man who's shouty on Twitter denouncing teachers. We see that actually he's got a special needs child in the local school that is deprived of funding, and you see him weep because of that situation. That inspires our human sympathy, which allows us to understand him even if we may disagree with him. And we start to see ourselves as a community where both of our kids go to the same school rather than political labels. It is a fundamentally different conception of democracy. It's a type of direct democracy. It's not direct democracy in its generality. We have to get very specific about what we're talking about.
And I guess it also covers what Jen was saying, which is, I think, is a really crucial point about digital inequality. And if we go to a deliberative process that is in person, maybe we go back to the really traditional town hall meeting in the little town, right? In person. That might be a better way forward to give people their voice back and a bit more control.
I think that's one option. I think the tricky thing is that there are so many ways, aside from digital technology, that people have been disempowered, especially the poor, working class, have been marginalized. There are there's multiple studies that just show, even on a survey, right, that people with lower levels of education and income are more likely to check "I don't know" or not want to answer, wherein they actually do have a very strong opinion. So I think the level of disempowerment, what I found studying the US South, is that also the question of racism and how that affects both online and offline people's ability to participate in politics is very strong. Of course, we have other questions around gender as well, and other constraints. But I think that, again, there's this myth that everyone can participate, whether it's offline or online. And I think we really have to tackle the broader structural inequalities before that can happen.
Also, does everyone really want to participate? I mean, I'm not sure that's the case.
I mean, to go to a town hall meeting where you're discussing the local bike path or picking up dog mess, no. But if the local town hall meeting is deciding the future of your local hospital, then you will go. There has to. This was the other consequence of the finding of James Fishkin, is that people will show up, and they are more likely to find consensus when there is really something at stake. The chap who wrote Nudge, what's his name, Cass Sunstein, who was a big kind of supposed thinker about the future of democracy in the Obama and Clinton administrations. And he showed that when people meet in groups, they tend to become more polarized, not less. In fact, the opposite finding of Fishkin. But the difference between them was that Sunstein's groups had nothing at stake. They were just meeting to agree an opinion, to have a debate. Whereas if there had been something really meaningful where we had to leave the room, if tonight we have to leave this room having decided the future of the OECD, or perhaps not that, but the future of the place where our children both go to school, then we would take that meeting seriously, and we bloody well would show up.
What about climate? We've seen the youth climate movement, and I was very struck by something the leader of the youth climate movement, Greta Thunberg, said, in fact, in an interview to my paper in Brussels, in which she said, after months of taking to the street and being very inspiring, she said she had been shocked and a little depressed to realize that it's harder to get legislation and decide exactly what to do practically in order to fight this climate emergency that we are facing. She said that she realized, she understood the stakes, but then in meeting with the stakeholders, understood how difficult it was for policymakers to strike the right balance. And I thought that was very interesting, because it's one of the criticisms that often comes back with the Gilets jaunes movement, that they are much more in the contestation phase. They protest, but they don't propose. Are we expecting too much of these people power movements to be able to also propose, or isn't that the logical extension of these movements?
I mean, I do think, climate is just the sort of, if Jamie's right, and I'm sure he is right, that we're living in a moment where the drift technologically and culturally towards forms of direct democracy, whatever that might mean, have momentum, might even be unstoppable. There is nothing less direct than climate, in the sense that, of course, it has very direct implications for people, but climate as an object is something that is known via computers in labs in universities, and it is acted on at the level of intergovernmental agreements and this sort of thing. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't things that we can all do in our day-to-day lives to do with our consumption patterns and so on, but climate as a policy problem, never has there been a policy problem that is more worthy or demands more strongly a action in the traditional liberal governmental sense, in the sense that it is something that transcends place, it transcends culture, it transcends community identity, and it transcends forms of direct participation as a type of problem, and it requires types of solution that will necessarily be very expert, technocratic, and governmental. Now, this isn't how I want the world to be. This is, I think, how it is fundamentally. Now, I think this means that the question of how that rather sort of what seems like an outdated, politically outdated, modernist, technocratic 20th century edifice of problem solving is wedded to this 21st century form of mobilization and affect-based political participation is the pressing question of the 21st century. And I think that one of the great things that someone like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has managed to do is precisely to start trying to knit those two things together by speaking about things like the environment as something where she talks about, I mean, maybe not climate change, but she says, there are young kids in the Bronx who are currently dying of lung diseases due to our inability to regulate the air and this sort of thing. There are farmers who are losing their jobs due to flooding. There are people whose livelihoods are being destroyed by this. And what she's managing to do is to try and build that bridge between visceral, first-hand experience and that necessarily technocratic governmental edifice, because we cannot, I'm in the OECD, so I imagine this is a fairly sympathetic audience to that sort of thing, but an international governmental edifice is going to be required. We know that. Of course, the most powerful contributor to right now is a reality TV star and a nihilist, a narcissist, and that is a massive problem which we don't quite know how to go around at the moment. But it's that, this is, I think, hovers over this discussion of direct democracy.
Jamie.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, it's quite interesting that you're sort of almost surprised that, as inspiring as she might be, that a 16-year-old is surprised that things are more complicated in government.
No, I wasn't. I just thought it was interesting to hear it.
No, but I mean, you're right. I mean, we've sort of placed all this faith in a 16-year-old to solve all these complicated problems. I mean, obviously, it's a bit of a tall order. I spent a lot of time with the environmental movement trying to come up with an answer to why isn't it bigger? Why are there more people at English Defence League rallies than there are fighting for the environment? Because it sort of, in a way, doesn't make sense, but it does make sense when you consider what Will just said. This idea of an abstract, it's a sort of, environmentalism became a kind of lifestyle choice for professional activists who would spend, it's relevant to discussions about political participation because no group that I ever spent time with would invest more time and energy in trying to make their movement inclusive while simultaneously being incredibly exclusive. They would spend weeks on debates about debates, the language you should use. I don't know if anyone's ever been to an Occupy event where there's all this hand language, you've got gestures, if you agree, you've got to put your hands in the air, and it's meant to be very inclusive, but actually what happens is people turn up, and unless you're part of the milieu of professional middle-class graduate activism, you think, what the hell is this? Is like a weird cult. And movements don't become large because they have technocratic ways of bringing people in. They become large because other people think they're like them and they kind of would feel comfortable there. And this has always meant that the environmentalist movement, in my opinion, has stayed much smaller than it should have done, almost by tragic accident. Things like the anti-fracking movement are very different because they are local. They're about people's, normally about either the noise pollution or the water quality. And as a result, and I've been to a lot of anti-fracking movements, you have a completely different set of people there. You have old and young, working class, middle class, who were all worried about a local issue. And then as soon as that dynamic is kicked off, I felt a lot more welcome at a fracking movement where you had literally have grannies serving you tea and cakes than at the very inclusive environmental activist movement where you need to understand all the language and the gestures to be part of it. And so if the environmentalist movement, and this is what Extinction Rebellion has explicitly tried to do, because I've been following them quite closely for a year now, they've explicitly tried to link the local with the abstract. It started off actually as a thing, you know, Ocasio-Cortez talking about air pollution in the Bronx. Extinction Rebellion actually started off as a pollution movement in London, Stop Killing London as it was called, with the aim of trying to link that to the abstract idea of environmental change. And if they can start doing that, then this people-powered movement of environmentalism will be enormous, but that is their challenge right now.
Jen.
Yeah, so I generally agree with what you're saying, Jamie, but with a slight disagreement. Any massive social change that we have seen throughout the world isn't because there's one big inclusive political or social movement organization. It's because there have been a variety of different organizations that come together in a very tenuous, but a coalition, right? So if we look, for example, at the civil rights movement in the United States, you had very radical activists, you had some groups that were mostly white, a lot that were primarily African American, you had different tactics, you had different strategies, and you know, just like the environmental movement now, yes, it is difficult to make legislation, but that legislation, however difficult, isn't going to shift unless there is this widespread movement. So unless the, you know, the anti-fracking movement and those traditional environmental movements and other movements and organizations really come together and coalesce to really, in my opinion, have really strong people power. And this idea of populism, this idea of people power, again, is nothing new. We've had it throughout history. Yes, we have some new tools, we have some new incarnations, but it's not new. And what is needed, again, is a coalition of people coming together, in particular to fight climate change.
So there's a question from the audience just on that issue, which is, why has the term populism taken on a negative connotation? You were just saying that it's existed for a long time. Why has it become so negative in our minds?
I think it has, honestly, I think that the term populism has really grown in popularity around specifically right-wing movements, and that it is mostly kind of left-leaning academics or journalists who are critiquing populism as a conservative movement.
So it brings me, sorry, just another question from the audience that's really on that, which is, should liberals fight authoritarian populism, which I guess is, you know, the right-wing one, with liberal populism? Is there such a thing?
No, I mean, the concepts are fundamentally contradictory because liberalism is about heterogeneity and not having a singular demand, except for more heterogeneity. So there's a fundamental contradiction. This is what I was saying at the beginning, that we have to find a way of animating the excitement and the idealism of a truly democratic society. Personally, I think it has to come through change, not endlessly justifying the status quo and finding different reasons why the populists are wrong, but actually introducing a dramatic new structural change, dramatic new policy. I think, you know, the answer to make the connection that Will and Jamie have correctly identified between the abstract of the climate problem and the reality of mobilizing people to address it, to me, that's through policy. That's through a punitive carbon tax that goes to the poor, that goes to redistribute. So you make it popular. You don't get... The Gilets jaunes, let's remember, came as a result of a reaction against Macron's, you know... Carbon tax, exactly. It's exactly the wrong way to do it. You have to design a really exciting policy idea. The Green New Deal has elements of it, though it's all terribly complicated and in the future. And it has to be done now, and that will animate us to feel excited about the current system of democracy, but personally I believe a radical reform of the system of democracy that is still democratic is the answer.
So we have 5 more minutes, and there's a question from the audience to each one of you that says, what's the most radical proposal you each have in mind as the, quote, next step forward for democracies, either in response or in mind of populism? The mics have fallen silent. Whoever has asked that question, well done.
One radical solution.
Well, the most radical proposal you have,
You've heard mine.
which is, remind us.
Well, it's to establish a system of direct democracy where the local decide and the decisions are fed up, or rather across to scale. And it's perfectly doable. It was done in a large city in Brazil, in Porto Alegre, where tens of thousands of people decided budget priorities that led to dramatic effects in redistribution of welfare, of medical, sanitation, education services. The World Bank testified to this, a sort of place that's taken seriously in buildings like this. It can be done. Unfortunately, it would take an imaginative politician to deliver it, which is, again, is a kind of contradiction, but I actually think that's the fastest way to deliver it, rather than people starting spontaneously their own assemblies, which would be my preference.
I'll answer it by somewhat deflecting the question about what I think we shouldn't do, right? So I think the focus in the last few years has been around these supervillains, right? Mark Zuckerberg, Putin, Trump, and that the focus has been kind of up here, right? If we just could get rid of Trump, then everything would be fine. Or if we could just get rid of Zuckerberg, or if Facebook could just really shift their policies and stop promoting fake news and stop promoting this hate, then that would solve the world's problems. And I think coming back to what Karin said, I think instead of looking up, we need to look down and at a more grassroots level, and also a more structural level of what is happening in terms of the massive, especially economic inequalities that are really generating a lot of this populist revolt.
Jamie.
Okay. So I already mentioned the one about the ballot box. So basically you should be able to go in, yes, we still have a representative system, we vote for one person, but then we also give grades for every single policy idea that they have. We put written feedback on in our ballot, and machine learning algorithms will be able to go through it. We'll basically have a much better idea of a mandate. I can't stand anything more than a government that's won a tiny majority and then claims to have a mandate for every single thing in its confusing, conflicting manifesto. So something like reforming the way that we actually vote in representative systems is one, and we should probably have a day off work as well to do that, because then we could turn that into a bit of a party and a celebration. We also need a complete overhaul of how we teach information literacy in schools. It's embarrassing. It's insofar as it even exists, which is usually 1 or 2 hours, it is either about traditional media literacy or understanding how algorithms work. And there's nothing in there about human psychology, for example, which is far more powerful than any algorithm. I mean, the biases that you have in your head are more powerful than Google's search algorithms. And just one final thing, the future of populist movements, the shape they take, will obviously change. I mean, I think the next wave of extreme movements is going to be anti-machine. It's going to be sort of a new form of neo-Luddism. So we should prepare ourselves for the idea that future radical politics might not look anything like they do today. And what we tend to do is see every next challenge in the light of the old one. Of course, we're always fighting the last war. So, for example, when we have a new wave of genuine green militancy, which we definitely will in the next 5 years, we will put them in the same box as Al-Qaeda and say these crazy terrorists are trying to do, which would be ridiculous and ludicrous. So we've got to be really careful about how we judge and understand new direct action militancy, because I think we're going to see even more of it in future.
Will?
I don't have a out-of-the-bag radical proposal for democracy, I'm afraid. And I might sound like the least radical person up here, I'm afraid. But one thing which I do think is always worth doing with this current populist surge is to look out for when they're speaking the truth, and to take that on board and to think about it carefully. And I think that one of the areas where populists do get a lot of their greatest purchase, and I'm talking about largely about these right-wing populists, Le Pen, Farage, Salvini, these sorts of figures, Trump, is the sense that the state and the media are a single sort of overlapping clique of people. And I think we have become numb to the extent to which that is true. And I don't know exactly what the policy proposal is. There's always kind of saying, oh, if we could fix the media, everything would be fine, is always too easy. But I think, you know, I know Britain the best. I mean, Britain, particularly since Blair came to power, the state has obsessed over spin and over using ex-journalists in order to manipulate messaging. Meanwhile, there are figures within broadcasters, figures within newspapers who are ex-politicians. There's been a lot of discussion, particularly since the Clinton era, of the revolving door between Wall Street and the White House. But there is also a revolving door between the media and the state. And I think that when people like Farage and Salvini and others stand up and talk about this, they all call it corruption, they all call it self-interest. I think it resonates because I think to some extent it's true. And I think there is a real responsibility on the part, I'm not waiting for Rupert Murdoch to suddenly start acting with responsibility, but there is, I think, a moral and political requirement that, that we start to, this is in some sense a classical liberal solution because it's about the separation of powers all over again, but about the separation of our media complex from the centres of power such that you don't see kind of, Jamie and I know each other because we used to work in think tanks, so I'm about to think tankery and this sort of cultural political circuit where you sort of move between different corridors of sort of speech and influence as being a sort of homogenous kind of gloop. And I think that has actually really created the opportunity for many of these sort of angry criticisms to arrive. So I'm blaming me and Jamie now. Sorry, and Khan.
Not to carry the flag of my quote-unquote people, us professional journalists, I have to say I struggle with naming a reporter, because there is a difference between an editorialist, a columnist, and a reporter, the reporter that you rely on to do fact-based reporting. Politicians or former spin doctors do not come back into the reporting realm. They do come back into the columnist realm.
Right, and that's why I think we need a robust and proud and radical defense of reporting. Now, it might be boring to some extent, but sometimes that's important. And I think that the loss of this sort of what's been called post-truth over the last 3 years is a lot to do with the collapsing distinction between...
AKA lies.
Well, lies, but also a sort of gloopy sort of factiness of you've got consultants who are paid in order to produce particular claims. You've got credit raters that were being paid by the people whose products they were being paid to rate. You've got this sort of, where the reporting ends and the commentating begins has become very, very unclear. So I think to come back to this sort of impassioned, affective, sometimes irrational defense of some liberal values would include a defense of some quite sort of some quite empirical type reporting skills.
Thank you very much. I want to really thank our panelists, and I'd like to invite you to thank them with me for this wonderful conversation. All right. Have a great day, everyone.